Hello, and welcome to another episode of On Target, a Eurasia Group Foundation production. I'm your host, Zuri Linetsky. I'm a researcher at the Eurasia Group Foundation. Today, I'm joined by David Arceneaux, an assistant professor of political science at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. Welcome, David.
Hey, Zuri, how's it going?
I'm well, thank you. How are you today?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me.
Even with the beginning of the semester, you're pretty good, huh?
As good as it's going to get. That's right.
As good as it's going to get. Yeah, I watch football shows, and there's a show called Hard Knocks. And I think that oftentimes they say at the beginning of the season, this is as good as you're going to feel until March.
I think that's right.
Okay. Well, again, thank you for joining me. We're going to talk a little bit about who you are, what you're working on, and why it's exciting to me and to everybody. So I thought I might give you an opportunity, or I think I might give you an opportunity to tell us a little bit about yourself, what you're working on, and your research.
Sure. So thanks for the introduction. Like Zuri said, my name's David Arceneaux. I'm an assistant professor of political science at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. I'm also just recently, I've started as the Rossetti Fellow for Future Conflict at the United States Air Force Academy's Institute for Future Conflict, where basically we're trying to set up a program to look at what does the next round of potential conflict for the U.S. military in different theaters look like. And as a result of that affiliation, now is a good time for me to go ahead and throw in the usual caveat that you might get used to hearing from anyone with any affiliation with the government, that the views expressed in this discussion are those of me and only me. They do not reflect the official policy position or policy of the United States Air Force or the United States government. And lastly, I'm affiliated with the Eurasia Group Foundation as a non-resident fellow. So I've been working with this group throughout the year and recently had a publication come out, hopefully that we'll get a chance to kind of at least tangentially talk about with another fellow, Rachel Teacott, on crisis escalation and how all of the stuff I'm working on ties into that. Substantively, my research is on nuclear stuff. Specifically, I focus on two core areas of research, one being nuclear command and control, meaning how states manage their nuclear forces, the other being nuclear platform diversification, meaning the types of delivery systems that states develop. So that's just kind of who I am, what I work on, and I'm looking forward to talking about whatever might be keeping you up at night in the nuclear world.
Oh, I mean, so much. I think nuclear weapons are so fascinating. And obviously, we have the war in Ukraine and Putin talking about the readiness of his nuclear forces. So lots to clear up, lots to talk about. Although before we get into this, can you tell me what the future of warfare will look like? Is it going to be, will it be hypersonic weapons and F-35s beyond visual range? Will it be space? Will it be Star Trek The Next Generation?
So I'm a bit of a traditionalist here. And I think it's nice that we get to drop all of these new and fancy terms like hypersonic glide vehicles. But I think at the end of the day, the ability to do things like combined arms integration and delegate the ability to do conventional battlefield operations that involve maneuvers, small unit dispersion, lower level command, etc. I think those are the things that are still going to dictate what conflict looks like for the most part moving forward. Our focus is really going to be on what the United States should worry about. And you could look at US national security documents, and it's kind of the same traditional concerns, the return of great power conflict. And I guess where my interest really ties into that is an area that I think receives a little less attention than it maybe should. And this is the potential for conventional conflict to result in nuclear escalation. And I'm sure we'll get to talk about that a little bit today. But I think that's my big concern is the role of nuclear brinkmanship on the way that these great powers engage in bargaining over outcomes like control of certain territories and regions, et cetera.
Okay. So I'm going to ask a really simple question, and maybe you kind of help me and potentially any viewers understand what we're talking about when we talk about nuclear weapons.
Sure.
What is a nuclear weapon, and why do we talk about them so much? And then in a really bad methodology turn, I'm going to ask you three questions in a row. What are nuclear weapons? Why do we talk about them so much? And why do they get so much more attention than things like chemical and biological weapons?
Sure. Okay. So what are nuclear weapons? These are the really short version of this is these are the ones that go boom in big fashion. They come in different types, and I'll spare the physics of it all, but they could be fission type, which is the old style where I think this is what most people are most traditionally familiar with, where you have some ball of nuclear material, you shoot a smaller piece of nuclear material in it that creates a nuclear chain reaction, big boom. There's also on the other extreme what we call fusion. This is combining nuclear particles, and the excess stuff produced by that process is heat and energy, and that also causes a large boom. And you can mix those two things together. But the short version of all this is simply to say the incorporation of nuclear material is not just for fun, it's not just because you can, but it's because it produces severe effects that we cannot get with conventional weapons, meaning what we think of as normal bombs and missile, etc. So when I think of nuclear weapons and why they kind of exist in this category on their own, I think there are two things I would point to. One is destructivity, basically how much damage these weapons can do relative to any other type of weapon. So just to illustrate here, let's think about the largest conventional weapon that the United States of
America used. The Moab. Coolest acronym ever. What is the Moab?
So the Moab is the mother of all bombs, and it's meant to be this hugely destructive conventional ordnance, just kind of measured in, and the way that we usually measure how much boom can be produced by a weapon is in basically tonnage equivalent of TNT.
Okay.
So the Moab, the mother of all bombs, is about 11 tons of TNT equivalent. So when you drop one Moab, you get about 11 tons of TNT going off at once. And that's a large bomb. I mean,
that's a lot of dead Wile E. Coyotes, if you will.
That's correct.
That's what I'm thinking is Wile E. Coyote trying to kill the Roadrunner.
Yeah, except the fuses actually work in this instance.
Okay, that's right. Yeah.
But so this is the largest conventional munition that the United States has deployed. It's as big as conventional goes. Let's now compare that 11 tons of TNT equivalent to the first nuclear weapon used by the United States, which is now outdated and in comparison small.
That's man or a little boy in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Correct. So over Hiroshima, the United States used one bomb that produced 15 kilotons of TNT equivalent. So that is over 1,300 times greater the explosive ordnance from one bomb.
Got it.
And now let's compare, that's a small kind of rinky-dink outdated weapon that almost any country could create. That's kind of the model that South Africa did just in secret during the late 1970s and through the 1980s, developing these simple fission type nuclear devices that they don't require that much knowledge, and they produce, again, over 1,300 Moabs at once in a single detonation. But things have become more sophisticated since then. And you can think of the W-87, which is a warhead that's on most of the United States intercontinental ballistic missiles that are launched from silos in the ground. That has a yield of about 300 kilotons. So again, if Hiroshima was 15 kilotons, each of these warheads has about 300 or 20 times Hiroshima per warhead. And each missile carries multiple of these warheads.
Yeah, MIRV is what that's called.
That's correct. So this is called MIRV, multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles. Multiple warheads, one missile. And the very short version of this is that getting one bomb with a bigger boom is actually less destructive than getting multiple warheads with slightly smaller booms, because the destructive capacity falls off pretty quickly as you go over greater distances. So instead of having one point of impact with a massive boom, having 8 points of impact with still very large booms is more destructive in the aggregate through that sense.
Man, I have so many more technical questions like about fratricide and things like that, but that might be getting too far into things here.
Sure.
My question for you is, so we're talking really about destructive power, and just to give anyone who's watching a sense of how a nuclear bomb works, I'd like for you to correct me if I'm wrong. But my understanding, and you said this when you were talking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bombs used over these places. Nuclear weapons don't work the same as a MOAB, right? A MOAB, you drop, it explodes on the ground, whereas a nuclear weapon, you explode above ground primarily. I mean, obviously, they can explode in any number of different ways. And then it's actually pressure, overpressure, that does most of the damage, in addition to radiation over the long term. Or have I gotten something wrong there?
Sure. So that's most of the way there. Let me just kind of add a couple of thoughts on that. So I think it's useful to start with what are the effects of nuclear weapons, because I just focused on the destructive capacity. But another thing that makes nuclear kind of distinct is that it produces other effects that conventional weapons and biological and chemical weapons, which you briefly referenced earlier, they don't produce those effects. One is thermal effects, which is just basically huge amounts of heat in a very sudden burst. And if you go look at the survivors of Hiroshima, most of them had basically thermal effects. They were burned from the flash of the bomb itself. And then also that heat, that extreme heat, lights stuff on fire. So this was one of the massively underappreciated effects of the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is the fire effects, which took not only the destructive overpressure that you just mentioned, which is just like sheer force knocking stuff over. This fire effect starts fires, spreads fires, etc. The third effect is radiation. And this is going to tie into what you were just talking about with where does the bomb detonate? So you can detonate the bomb anywhere from ground level to exoatmospherically, outside of the actual atmosphere. It depends what you're trying to do. If you detonate closer to the ground, it will be more likely to destroy the target that you're trying to blow up on the ground, unsurprisingly. But this is where the concern of radiation is highest, because what happens is when you detonate the bomb close to the ground, that fireball sucks up a lot of particles from the earth, pulls them up and irradiates them before distributing them over long distances.
That's the mushroom cloud that we see with nuclear explosion.
Exactly. And when that's pulling in more of the ground particulate to spread, there is higher levels of radiation being scattered over longer distances.
Okay.
Versus if you want to do what's called an air burst, you detonate it high above the ground, that will have less radiation, less radioactive fallout, because it's not pulling up as much from the ground to disperse.
Okay.
But it will be less capable of destroying something on the ground. So this is where there are big advances in technology right now. There are these things that colloquially we call super fuses. And the goal of these is to basically allow these fuses to detect when the bomb is close enough to destroy the target, but hopefully gives a chance to let it detonate far enough above ground so that you're not irradiating particles and spreading them.
Wow.
With the idea being that you can focus on what you're trying to actually destroy without having the widespread fallout that makes a bad outcome even worse for places in theater and beyond.
That's like quality control for nuclear weapons.
Unfortunately, yes. I think that's a good
That's amazing. I hadn't actually heard of that. So we've now talked about what nuclear weapons are. They're the most destructive type of special ordnance. Let's call, if you're okay with that. They carry much more destructive power than even the biggest conventional bombs that we have, and they can be detonated like many bombs in different ways. And we have ICBMs, which are intercontinental ballistic missiles, but they're also different platforms. So we've also got submarine-based, we've got silo-based, and then we've got air-based. And if I read my Robert Jervis correctly, that's called the nuclear triad. And that's kind of the gold standard of nuclear weaponry, maybe.
That's right. So the nuclear triad is useful. One thing I'll actually add before switching over is we've talked a lot about the effects of nuclear weapons. The last thing that I want to mention as what's kind of distinct to them is the time frame. Think about the terrible destruction that we just talked about as being possible. And nothing else on Earth can accomplish that level of destructiveness within a matter of minutes. Okay. Chemical weapons can't do that stuff, and they certainly can't do it in a matter of 20 minutes. Okay. Neither can biological weapons. The level of destruction that you can achieve with all of these bad effects in a matter of minutes is just horrifying to think about. In my mind, that is really what sets nuclear weapons apart.
Okay.
But now let's kind of build on this logic of timeliness, because it ties into the logic of what you're calling the nuclear triad. So the basic argument is that a good nuclear weapon state should have different delivery systems, different ways of taking the warhead, getting it to target, and making it go boom. Because when you have these different delivery systems, it is less likely that the adversary can focus its efforts on one of those legs and prevent you from having a viable nuclear arsenal, or a nuclear deterrent, I should say. And the triad is a useful heuristic for thinking about this. You have air-launched, ground-launched, and sea-launched capabilities. And in theory, the more that you have across those three legs of the triad, the more survivable and the stronger and more robust your nuclear arsenal is. Just for the sake of being contrarian, I will say that I think, and this is where it will be very obvious that my opinions do not reflect those of certain governmental organizations, but I think that the nuclear triad itself is kind of overstated in terms of its utility. What does having a whole bunch of ground-based silos with nuclear weapons in them provide the United States, for example? If other countries know where they are, they're not particularly survivable. And in reality, what those silos do is it forces the adversary to target the silos, knowing that there are nuclear weapons in them, and kind of reduce the amount of warheads available to target cities and other military assets. But in terms of pure survivability and the ability of the United States to respond to an attack with nuclear force, things like that are not necessary. They give you some advantages, they come with other disadvantages. So I just want to make sure that I'm throwing this out there, as the triad is kind of historically considered the gold standard, but other countries have been much more comfortable without. So the United Kingdom currently deploys only submarine-launched ballistic missiles for nuclear deterrence. At any given moment, they only have one submarine on patrol, just kind of swimming around in the Atlantic with nuclear weapons on board, so that if things go wrong, the United Kingdom can respond with nuclear force. That's very different extreme, and doctrinally, the United States has different things it wants to do with its arsenal. But I think this triad is still a useful heuristic of thinking about where do these different platforms fit and what do they actually give you in terms of deterrence.
So we have a lot to talk about with your research. We're gonna have like a series of really quick, short answer questions.
Sure.
First, how many countries have declared nuclear weapons programs?
Now the word declared is important here.
Yes.
Currently, there are 8 declared nuclear weapon states.
Okay.
Israel is the 9th nuclear weapon state that neither confirms nor denies. And that's right. So Israel is kind of, there's a great book called The Worst Kept Secret about Israel's nuclear weapons program. And bonus trivia fact, South Africa would have been the 10th nuclear armed state. It developed nuclear weapons, did a cold test in 1979, and by the early 90s had totally decommissioned its nuclear weapons program. So currently looks like 9, 8 official nuclear weapon states.
And that's counting India and Pakistan.
Correct. That's correct.
Okay. And then do we count Iran or not Iran?
No. So the 9 that I would count are the United States, Russia, China, United Kingdom, France, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel.
Can't forget about North Korea.
That's right.
Okay, so there are 9 current nuclear powers as far as we know.
Correct.
And then let's talk about this idea of, so what is MAD?
Sure. So MAD is the label that everyone's kind of heard before, is mutually assured destruction.
And what is mutually assured destruction?
It is one of the most poorly understood basic concepts in nuclear deterrence. So the idea of mutually assured destruction, if you take it word by word, it should be very straightforward. Mutual, it will apply to both parties involved in this relationship. It is mutually shared. Assured, it is going to happen. Destruction, it will be very painful. So the logic is that if you have 2 countries with sophisticated nuclear arsenals, and neither country can do something that would, if they attacked first, prevent the other side from retaliating with nuclear force. If that applies in both directions, then you are engaged in the condition of MAD, mutually assured destruction, because no matter what you do, It applies to both of you, and it is guaranteed that you will lose significant amounts of cities, people, and military capabilities.
And that was something that developed during the Cold War between you. That it's a fact, not an idea. It's important to say, if I understand correctly.
Yes.
And this was articulated initially during the Cold War, when we get this kind of what you talk about, survivable, whether it's, we talk, from what I've read, and I'm not an expert on this, it's the survivable triad, but it actually can be a survivable nuclear force of any kind. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right. So, and I really want to drive home a great point you just made. This is why I said that MAD is so generally misunderstood. MAD is, some people refer to it as a strategy. A strategy is how you try to get what you want. And if your strategy to advance security and protect your homeland is to arm your adversary to the teeth with a sufficiently large nuclear arsenal that you are always vulnerable, I don't think that's what most policymakers have in mind. MAD is a condition that simply arises. It is a fact, like you said.
Okay.
And the triad is considered to feed into this, because when you have these different delivery systems, it's hard for another side to preempt or decapitate, meaning prevent you from actually authorizing the use of nuclear weapons. But anything you can do to make sure that no matter what, if you attack me with everything you have at once, I can still hit back. That is when MAD works.
So last rapid fire question. Are there nuclear weapons in space?
I would say, first, I don't have a security clearance that would give me access to that information. So I'm not in the know. I'm not in the know. They're not supposed to be. And
we have a treaty on this. Is that correct?
I'm sorry?
There's a treaty preventing
That's correct.
Arming of space.
So here's the one weird example that I will give. And it was not nuclear armed, but if you remember, to not long ago, China tested what was called a fractional orbital bombardment system.
Yeah.
The Soviets had tested this as well during the Cold War. The idea here is, rather than a ballistic missile, which you launch, it goes up, and then it comes back down on a parabolic trajectory.
The trajectory around its trajectory. We don't have to get into the dynamics of it, but that's
right.
Okay.
Well, it's the dynamics matter here for the FOBS, the fractional orbital bombardment system, because it uses, basically, it goes out of the atmosphere into space, and it uses gravity to just kind of pull itself around Earth, and then it re-enters. So some people worry that this would be in violation of that treaty. So this is where you start getting into those weird kind of definitional things. The reason that I'm skeptical that these platforms really exist, though, is because there's no state that really has the ability to decisively, with 100% confidence, target a nuclear armed adversary and say, you know what, I've got them all. Even United States against North Korea, there are real concerns. What if you miss a handful? And North Korea is only estimated to have about 60-ish nuclear warheads at the moment. Is missing maybe 5 enough to make you go, maybe we shouldn't do that?
Right.
I think on average, the answer is yes. And proponents of ballistic missile defense say, well, we can probably get them, but ballistic missile defense doesn't have a great track record. So you're still left with uncertainty. And I think states look at this and realize, is it worth spending the money, investing in the research, and violating a treaty for no real value added?
Right.
And for that reason alone, I think states tend to go with, we know this is probably good enough, let's stick with it.
And this is also, and as an aside, before we jump into your research, this is probably what's keeping a conflict between Israel and Iran from breaking out, because of what if we miss something? This could actually be really bad in the long term.
Always a concern. That's right.
I mean, I don't want you to prognosticate, right? But it's something that that both sides would have to think about in terms of any kind of confrontation between the two actors.
That's right. The only thing I'll caveat here is there's no evidence that Iran is currently capable of fielding a nuclear weapon. Yeah. So the concern from Iran is, yes, Israel could probably respond with nuclear weapons, even though they don't officially have them.
Right.
For Israel, the concern is, if we try to get rid of Iran's nuclear program, if we don't get it all, which the odds of you killing everybody who knows everything about nuclear weapons in facilities that have become hardened and underground, and they're just really hard to destroy, the odds are quite low. You might actually encourage Iran to accelerate its momentum towards nuclear weapons. So the fears that these sides have in that particular example are the same logic, just slightly different in the particulars.
So this is actually a great segue into your research. You work on command and control.
Right.
So let's talk about this. You mentioned at the beginning what command and control is. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about your research. Let's talk about why command and control matters. And then, let's talk about the cases. I think your cases are fascinating. Apartheid era, South Africa, Pakistan, India, United Kingdom. So let's just start with command and control, why it fascinates you. And, is this something that, maybe contextualize it with Vladimir Putin escalating the readiness of his military, of his nuclear forces, although it's unclear what that may or may not mean.
Sure. So great. So first and foremost, defining it. And then second, why does it matter? I define nuclear command and control as the operational means by which a state conducts the management, deployment, and potential release of nuclear weapons. Basically, what that means is whether during peacetime and or during crises, how do states manage their nuclear arsenals? And this is interesting to me to more directly answer your question, because when I was looking for a dissertation topic, I was looking at the old literature from the Cold War era, where Peter Feaver in particular from Duke is the person who kind of started this research agenda and said, truthfully, we just don't have data. So what we can do is we can look at the US example and say, here's what we know from the US experience during the Cold War. What do we expect to see in these other countries? And the very short version of what I found is that Feaver's expectations did not work out in practice. And I say this in all kindness to Peter Feaver. He's my co-author on a piece on nuclear command and control. He would tell you the same thing. We were taking best guesses with what we had, and things just didn't play out quite the same. And so what I've done is I've tried to say, okay, why didn't those things help us understand this variation, and what does help us understand the way that command and control systems look differently? And the way that I think it's useful to think about this concept is the traditional framework that folks would use when thinking about nuclear command and control is that every state, and this dilemma I think is true, every state is bound what's known as the always never dilemma. And what that fundamentally means is that every country with nuclear weapons has to simultaneously address two competing pressures. On the one hand, the always side of the dilemma is that every state wants to make sure that nuclear weapons are always able to be used when ordered. Okay. However, at the same time, those same states want to make sure that nuclear weapons are never used unless authorized. Okay. And the reason that this is problematic and called a dilemma is because anything you do to promote the always side, make sure that reliability is high, comes at the expense of never, safety and security. So if you think to your famous Nicolas Cage movies where you find a nuclear weapons device and there's some sort of thing that you have to type in an alphanumeric code to actually enable the nuclear weapon. Those are called technical controls. If you put those kinds of things in a nuclear weapon, it delays the ability to use them. It restricts the number of people who know how to access them, etc. So it's good for never. It's more safe, it's more secure, but because it takes more people and more time, always suffers, because what if the adversary attacks while you're trying to figure out the right code and authorizing, etc. So all countries are trying to figure out how to balance that. And in the Cold War, the debate was, you do one of two things. Do you delegate or do you assert? To delegate, short version, means you let lower level commanders, typically in the military, decide when and whether to use nuclear weapons. Even if they're supposed to await authorization, they have the ability to use nuclear weapons. That's delegation.
So just to put the rubber on the road here, in the worst case scenario, the United States is involved in a conflict. And let's say in Europe during the Cold War, a commander in the field or some not general or member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has the button, and he calls the White House and says, "Hey, we're in trouble. We need to launch a nuclear weapon." He has to wait for the answer, yes, but he could just press the button with theoretically. That's delegation.
That's correct. So the fear is exactly what you're talking about. Imagine nuclear artillery commander during the Cold War, sometimes as low as a lieutenant colonel, has the ability. They're supposed to call up and say, "Hey, the Soviets are advancing and we're in fear of being overrun. Well, if you make the call, or if your communications are severed and you're that field commander and you're saying, we are certainly going to be overrun, you're facing what we think of as use them or lose them pressures. Do I use nuclear weapons, my nuclear tipped artillery, to try and prevent the Soviets from advancing, or at least prevent them from acquiring my nuclear weapons? Or do I lose them and retreat and let the Soviets take over those nuclear weapons? Delegation is concerning because when you enable numerous people at lower ranks to make that decision, even if they're supposed to wait for higher authorization, they are given conditions under which they are told it is your call. That's delegation, and that's where the fear of crisis escalation becomes very real.
Understood.
That's right.
Okay.
The other extreme of that is assertion. Basically, civilian leadership, political leadership maintains control very close to the vest, very tight, to prevent that kind of stuff. But the problem is if you sever communications and the lower field commanders can't reach you or they can't get the codes to unlock things, there's a chance that you won't be able to respond.
Understood. Okay. So these are the elements of the things that you study.
That's right.
Okay. And then so then in your work, in your forthcoming book project, what is the elevator pitch, as it were?
Sure. So there are basically three components, I guess, if I'm just talking about the pure pitch. One is I've spent the last few years basically flying around the world and trying to get people to tell me things that they may or may not be supposed to tell me. So I've been trying to gather actual data. And I've gone to India, South Africa, worked with I've gone to the United Kingdom, spoken with officials there, done archival research there. And I've spoken with officials from Pakistan and the United States. And between those four countries, which I will loosely say because I'm anonymizing some and not others, I will simply say I've had some success in some cases getting feedback on the thinking that goes into it and what nuclear command and control looks like. Okay. The big contribution that I'm making is really conceptual. So during the Cold War, we thought about, do states assert, do they delegate?
Uh-huh.
But I think when you think about having nuclear weapons, if you have them, you must have a plan for using them. Yeah. And if you plan to use them at some point, you must delegate. So in my mind, the question is not whether you delegate the ability to use nuclear weapons, but rather when that delegation occurs. Okay. And I build around a framework of, do you delegate during peacetime, meaning even when things are nice, lower level military commanders have the ability to use nuclear weapons. So the United Kingdom is my classic example of this, where that submarine is out on patrol. Yes, they're supposed to wait for authorization and they're professionally trained. They'll wait and do everything they can to authorize. But in the most literal sense, they have everything they need on board to conduct a nuclear attack during peacetime. Okay. The other extreme is during a crisis, late crisis, I should say. So after significant fighting, leaders say, okay, you know what, this is getting out of hand. Let's enable the military to respond. The thing I'm really adding is this in-between category of early crisis delegation. Okay. And this is to say, when things start to look scary, countries that worry they might not have a very survivable arsenal might start delegating at that moment. And this can feed into all sorts of fears because you're already in a crisis, information is low, uncertainty is high, fears and tensions are also high. If one side starts preparing its arsenal for use, clearly just in its own mind to defend itself, but the other side sees that, this is where we start getting some new pathways for nuclear escalation. So really my contribution here is to come up with an explanation for why states choose peacetime, early crisis, late crisis delegation. I've provided that kind of new framework and trying to explain why that happens.
So is this why people get really worried about whenever India and Pakistan get really angry at one another, theoretically over Kashmir, that this could escalate, is because there is a different form of delegation in this context, just to pick from your case studies, for example?
Sure. So this is a great question. The short answer is yes. And in particular, I think people worry a lot about Pakistan's nuclear doctrine. And Pakistan is in a place where they have conventional military inferiority. Okay. Most people would say there's some room for disagreement there, but I think the conventional wisdom is at least in a conventional war, over time, Pakistan's in trouble, if only because its primary, what we call lines of communication, which is literally how you communicate between different military locations, but how you travel, how you sim logistics, etc. That's only about 20 kilometers from the border. So if India crosses the border and severs those lines of communication, which run north-south, and if India were to come in and cut that in half, basically Pakistan's in a really tough position where they can't connect the entirety of their military force.
Okay.
So what Pakistan has done to offset this conventional inferiority is it's developed what we call tactical nuclear weapons. No one agrees on how to define those things, but the essence is basically they're meant to use in the battlefield. So Pakistan has these tactical nuclear weapons that it would mobilize and prepare to use in a military conflict against India's advancing military forces. And the fear is, does that process or the actual use of nuclear weapons, even just preparing the arsenal for use, does that create a spiral that gets out of hand and makes something that's already bad totally get out of control?
Totally understand. Now, am I right in thinking that when I see these military parades, that it's the big, long things that we should be worried about on the trucks?
That's a pretty safe bet, yes.
Okay, just checking. So we have some dictators just with big nuclear weapons riding through their capital cities.
Right.
Okay, that's
just for show.
Just for show. All right, well, I want one. Yeah, seriously. I want to just drive the truck. I don't need the nuclear weapon. I think that would be fun. Okay, so I want to talk, we've been talking for a while, so I wanted dollars to donuts. Let's talk a little bit in the last few minutes that we have about Ukraine.
Sure.
And you've written with Rachel Teacott recently about nuclear weapons for the national interest.
Right.
Let's talk about a little bit about what you wrote about there, and then let's contextualize it for Ukraine. What are we worried about?
Sure. So Rachel and I wrote this piece in the national interest at the very end of July. I think it came out on July 31st. And basically, we were looking at the nature of the discourse around how people were thinking about nuclear threats from Russia during this war in Ukraine. And right at the beginning of the war, Putin's made statements and increased alertness and readiness levels and all these things. A lot of vague statements about, if you do this, we will respond with force like you've never seen, just kind of empty statements. And what's happened is, I think, two things. One is people have said, okay, he's been making these threats now for months and nothing's come of them. Who cares? Like he's bluffing. And second, saying, okay, he's not looking for suicide. He wouldn't do it anyways. The interjection that Rachel and I effectively made is, you don't actually have to cross certain red lines. You don't have to actually do certain things to still get to nuclear disaster. And the fear here is that if something were to happen in which Russia starts losing severely in the battlefield, and it says, you know what we're going to do to try and stop this is we're going to actually increase nuclear readiness. Whereas earlier in the conflict, they said they were going to do this, but we didn't actually see the operational adjustments, meaning warheads were here and missiles were here. They actually weren't even mated. So you can't launch a nuclear weapon if it's not on the thing that you're going to launch. So the United States could have watched and observed and seen those things happen. So early in the crisis, even though they declared higher levels of readiness, it looks like that was mostly more phone calls, checking in with different units, etc. But let's say now that we're in a world where Russia's getting rolled back and it says, okay, we're going to actually increase readiness and hope that scares the West into slowing down. Now imagine the warheads are on the missiles and under the control of field commanders. The concern that we had was effectively, if you're only thinking about the potential for nuclear use from a very purposeful sense, you're missing a really scary avenue where things could simply go wrong. And that is some of the stuff we've already talked about. So I don't need to go into detail too much, but if you have a field commander with nuclear weapons that thinks I'm about to be overrun, and I also can't communicate with leadership, maybe I should use them. Or, like I said earlier, maybe the act of preparing nuclear weapons for use leads the other side to say, okay, maybe we should try and target these facilities, interfere in this process, etc. And this is not to necessarily say one policy approach is better or worse necessarily. This is a severely underappreciated pathway for things to go wrong that people were not looking at. And it's fundamentally a problem of command and control, where trying to prepare your arsenal for readiness can open these different avenues to escalation that, in our estimation at the time, were simply not receiving nearly enough attention in the what should the West do to support Ukraine discussions.
And so is the payoff then that you have to pay attention to the command and control and readiness situation of the Russian military forces, whether you're mating warheads and missile bodies, if you will, and then that has some knock-on effect for NATO and the United States, or is it just for Ukraine? Because there's a whole nother bag of worms that we would have to get into with regards to, well, who goes to war if Russia launches a nuclear weapon against Ukraine? Now, that's a subject for a different time. But what's the knock-on effect? Where does the spiral occur in this case?
Sure, it could occur in a lot of different areas. So let's kind of take the two different problems that I just flagged. One is the United States has tremendous national technical needs, meaning intelligence stuff. The United States can see what's going on and monitor. One problem is the United States can see that and go, oh no, do we get involved? Maybe, maybe not. The United States has drawn pretty hard lines of, we're not planning to target Russia. So I actually think there's probably a relatively low likelihood there. But I can certainly imagine the United States, which has done a remarkable campaign of declassifying and sharing intelligence to try and preempt the Russians from doing things. It's not hard to imagine another step in that, or passing the information on to Ukraine and saying, just so you know, here's what's coming. And Ukraine having to seriously consider, okay, well, we have maybe just the missile components. Can we target those before they're fully nuclear? That places pressures that are escalatory. They increase the likelihood of things getting out of hand. Ukraine would simply have to make a decision. Do we attack nuclear-related stuff or not? So that's one problem.
And that could further escalate the situation.
Exactly, because then what's Russia's response to that? Okay, they're targeting. We mobilize more nuclear weapons, and we make sure that they're defended and they're protected, and maybe we ready them to use earlier. That's right. So it's really all about this spiral logic. And that's just about the observing a change component. The other is, let's say we get through that phase and the United States sees it and they say something to Ukraine and nobody acts on it. Everyone just kind of sits with it and knows, okay, this could be a problem. Once that delegation has occurred, such that lower level commanders have the ability to use those nuclear weapons, their increased levels of readiness, this is, imagine now a world in which you have a conflict where Ukraine is fighting in an area where Russia has located these tactical nuclear weapons. What if Ukraine accidentally targets those nuclear weapons? This is Barry Posen's old argument about inadvertent escalation. You didn't even mean to blow those things up, but you did. And now Russia's saying, oh no, they're targeting our nuclear capabilities. Or again, the use them or lose them pressures for theater commanders. There are a lot of these different pathways through not only observing it, but also getting to that world. Both create different types of problems where, without ever actually meaning to get nuclear use, you can end up in a world where nuclear weapons become usable anyways.
Okay, so I have two final questions for you.
Great.
First, do nuclear weapons make us safer or less safe? Now, this is a rapid fire question because I know that could lead to a dissertation level answer. I think you could write several books about that.
Yes, and coincidentally, I just hired a research assistant to talk exactly about this question of what we call nuclear optimism. The world is maybe better, or it's not as bad as people think, versus pessimism. These things are bad and dangerous. The short version is, I think that the risks of purposeful nuclear exchange are quite low. I think that uncertainty we talked about early on deters purposeful nuclear use. But on average, I think I side with the pessimist in that I worry about things going wrong, misperception, miscalculation, opening doors to where things can get out of hand, and the likelihood of nuclear accidents and unauthorized use increases as nuclear weapons become more and more prevalent.
Okay, there's this old story about Kissinger getting a phone call in the middle of the night, and he says, okay, oh, you think there's nuclear weapons coming? Call me back in 20 minutes. And it turns out it was a flock of geese or something. But that type of that type of awareness and that type of calmness gets a little bit calmness under pressure gets a little bit more frazzled if you're in a situation like Ukraine.
Right.
It sounds like
that's exactly right.
So my last question for you is, and I mean, obviously I have to ask you this, was John Mearsheimer right? Should Ukraine have just kept its nuclear weapons?
So I think this is actually, there's a really technical answer to this, and I will largely punt viewers to go read a piece by Cheryl Rofer.
Okay.
The short version is, in terms of logic, sure, it would have been great if Ukraine could have kept nuclear weapons and had a deterrent, knowing that it was a former country under occupation, effectively under Russia's rule during the Soviet Union. And that in the future you would, and this was why Ukraine was kind of reticent to give them up. But there were very technical problems about tritium production and making sure that the types of nuclear weapons they had, they could continue producing the stuff they needed, getting past those technical controls to actually enable them for use, having the command and control systems access to the Chegets, the little Soviet equivalent of the nuclear football that we see in the United States. There were a lot of technical hurdles to actually making those things usable in Ukraine. So between US pressure and Soviet or former Soviet pressure at the time, and just the inability to actually use those specific weapons, I think it's a little unfair to say they simply should have kept them, when in reality, keeping them would have ultimately by now made them fairly large and expensive paperweights, probably.
Right. Okay. So that's a great answer to that question. Turns out maintaining nuclear arsenals is incredibly complicated, and you have to secure them too.
That's right.
Which is a completely other catastrophe to worry about.
Exactly.
Well, look, David, I want to thank you. This has been a fascinating conversation. I think nuclear weapons are amazing. They're awe-inspiring technology, and obviously, they're not just nuclear technology. Is not just for weaponry. There's all sorts of civilian technologies associated with this. But you obviously focus on the most interesting type of technology associated with nuclear weapons. And I just want to thank you very much for spending so much time with us and letting me understand a little bit more about how nuclear weapons work and what this stuff my nightmares will be made of for the next few nights.
Absolutely. Happy to keep you up with me as I fret over the same concerns, and really appreciate you having me on.
Thank you so very much, and have a great afternoon.
Yeah, you as well. Thanks, Zuri.